Well, good morning. It's good to see each and every one of you here today. My name is Garrett Robinson. I'm one of the pastors here at University Baptist Church, if we haven't had a chance to meet. As Steve Johnson mentioned, our pastor, Dr. Laufer, is away this week and will be joining our mission team. That'll be in Columbia, and I know you'll be praying with them and for them as they go on this trip, as they are about God's purpose and going on behalf of our church into a place where there are refugees, where there are people who've been displaced for a lot of different reasons, people that they're going to be able to minister to. And I know you'll be praying with them and for them as they go. If this is your first Sunday, or maybe you've been out for a little bit, we've been in the process of going through a series where we've been looking at Jesus' first year of ministry. And through this process, through this series that we've been walking through, we've been looking at how did Jesus go about really identifying himself? How did he really go about revealing himself in many ways to the people that he had come to work with, to minister with, for the hope that he was going to have? How did Jesus go about that? And we've been using the book of John to talk about that as John lays out in his gospel what he is about, how he's going through that. He uses different stories from Jesus' ministry, brings them together. One of the critical things, and we'll talk about this in a few moments, is that John uses a series of signs to confirm with his readers who Jesus is and who Jesus was in his ministry. And that's an important part of what goes on. And in the process, we've talked about a number of key signs that John has used. And particularly today, we're going to be looking at one of the important signs that Jesus has in his life and ministry, and that is that Jesus works miracles. And today we're going to be looking in the 5th chapter of John about Jesus being a miracle worker. We're going to look at a scene that maybe you've heard about before, you've heard about in whether it's Sunday school or group time or through different sermons. Miracles are important. They're important events. They're astounding events. They're compelling events. That Jesus came and was a miracle worker is something that is unique in his time. Now, there's been a lot of talk over the last couple years, kind of maybe you've heard it through the media and so forth. You know, Jesus really wasn't that significant. He wasn't that unique. He wasn't this kind of a person that came and lived among these people in a way that was surprising because there were a lot of people like Jesus. Well, the fact of the matter is that Jesus is unique. His ministry is unique. It is from God. And one of the ways that he shows that he is a unique person sent from God is because he does have miracles. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. Miracles are important to understanding the nature of Jesus' ministry because I believe that Jesus still performs miracles as a continued sign. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. We're going to walk through a passage. And I know that maybe in your own life you've heard, maybe in your own family, your friends, people where you live, work, and play, you've heard about people that have needed a miracle. You've heard about people that have had a miracle. As I was walking through, maybe pulling together the things that we're going to talk about today, had conversations with different people, and things come up about places where they've been touched by God, people that they know that have seen something miraculous happen. It reminded me also of a story that I heard a number of years ago. There was a young family, and they had 2 small children. They were living the everyday kind of life that you and I live. They were good people. They didn't have a lot of money, but they worked hard. And one morning they had 2 children. One was named Andrew. Andrew was 6, and then they had Tess. Tess was 8. And one morning Andrew woke up and he was complaining about a headache. And one of those things, Mom went and tended to him and got him better and sent him along his way, and the headache subsided. Wasn't really anything to worry about. And then a couple weeks later, the headache came back. A couple more days later, the headache was there again. That abiding sense, that foreboding that begins building in that family's life. There's something that's not right. Headaches shouldn't happen in a 6-year-old. They shouldn't happen with this severity. They shouldn't happen with this frequency. And then Andrew passed out at school. And Andrew was sent home, and his mom was very frantic, as a parent may well be and should be. There's something unexplainable going on in their son. There's something that doesn't make sense. This is a healthy child. He runs around. He does all kinds of things. But then there was that trip to the doctor. And that trip to the doctor sent to the trip to the specialist later that day. And generally when you get sent to the specialist later that day from going and seeing a doctor, the sign isn't good, and it wasn't. After running some tests, after doing some diagnostic work, they realized there was something growing inside of Andrew's head. And in Andrew's head, it was difficult to understand exactly what it was, but it was growing and it was making his life more and more difficult. See, Andrew was at the specialist and realized there could be some therapy there. There could be something that could happen. There could be a miracle that was needed. But the reality was that his parents saw that there was going to be tough times because they were good people. They were everyday people. They worked hard. They just didn't happen to have a lot of money. And surgery is expensive. It's expensive to get sick. And the challenge that they were running into is that they realized as they encountered this, not only was their child in a place where there was something going on that they couldn't exactly explain, the specialist wasn't completely clear as to what was happening, but they also realized that there was a possibility out there for him, but they needed an exact specific procedure by an exact specific person. And the money was going to be really hard to get. And they went on about their daily routines, recognizing that there was an impending sense that decisions needed to be made. And as a parent, you'll do whatever you can for your kids, but there was going to be a lot that was needed. They reached out and tried to see about securing some funds, some ways that they could get some assistance, and that wasn't readily available to them. So they went on about their regular days, and they tried to make the home as comfortable as possible. At night, they would put the kids to sleep, and they would have hushed conversations about what is next, what can we do. At one point, Andrew's dad mentioned, the challenge that we're going to run into is that Andrew just needs a miracle. He needs a miracle to get back to where he is. I think in a lot of ways we resonate with that kind of a story. We resonate with that reality that there are people, maybe ourselves, maybe people that we know that need a miracle in our lives, in their lives. And the challenge of miracles is that they're often in overwhelming demand and in short supply. We often wonder, and from a pastoral perspective, it's challenging because you encounter people that you're like, God, this person needs a miracle. And when I read through Scripture, it seems so easy, but then I also forget the context of Scripture being over years and years and years. And then I hear about different things that happen with people. The challenge of miracles is that indeed we all need miracles. A miracle is an act that appears contrary to nature and is an act of God. It's probably a very good definition of a miracle. Many years ago, back in the mid-1700s, a philosopher named David Hume, who was an atheist, criticized miracles, called miracles a violation of the laws of nature. He said that they were impossible, and he laid out a number of categories as to why they were impossible. A couple of years ago, there was a theologian named Craig Keener who wrote a 2-volume work on miracles called Miracles. And in that 2-volume work on miracles, he heads off that conversation about whether miracles are possible, whether miracles are tenable, whether miracles actually exist. And he found 300 some odd examples of miracles documentable miracles within the last 20 years, and he included them in his book. So we know that miracles are out there. We know that we hear about them. You'll find them in different places. It's hard for us, though, to talk about miracles because while we still see miracles today, we have to recognize that we still need miracles today. We live in a STEM community. We live in we live in this technological society. We live among people who are very well educated, who are very good at their jobs, are specialists in different ways. I'm involved in conversations with people on an ongoing basis about these things, and people talk about the challenge of miracles. They live in a very material world, that there's a very clear scientific method, and things operate in regard to these scientific methods, and absolutely we agree that God has properly ordered the world to allow us to exist and to function in that way. But that miracles, I believe, still exist. Miracles still happen. We hear about them. We hear about things that go on with people. And again, in talking about these conversations and preparing for this, I hear from different places and different people. Maybe it's conversations that we have, or I was able to have, that were provoked by the Spirit, that people would say, yeah, I had a miracle happen. I went in for a test and then realized I needed surgery. When I showed up to that surgery, I didn't need it anymore. Something happened. Or they talk about how they needed to have a certain kind of situation be arranged. A lot of times we think about healing miracles as being the primary miracle. There are other ways that they needed to have a relationship arranged in certain ways so they could go and find a connection so that they could provide for their family. You know, we still see miracles today. We still need miracles today. What's the kind of miracle that you're needing today? What's that thing that somebody that you know where you live, work, and play needs today? What is that miracle that's out there? Miracles are hard to talk about oftentimes, but they're something that we need to see. Because again and again, when we come to the Gospels, and again, as we're walking through this first year of Jesus' life, one of the things that we know is that Jesus is a miracle worker. Jesus is a miracle worker. When we look at, and this is actually really exciting things that I talk about with some friends that are in the academic world, we've not lived in a time in the last 100 years where more scholars believe that Jesus existed, lived exactly where he said he lived according to exactly how he's said to have lived in the time that he was said to have lived, and did things that were wondrous. It is, by and large, most scholars, even most critical scholars that are out there, people that don't go to church on Sunday, people that don't see Jesus as a salvation figure or a Messiah, they would even tell you that a couple things that we know about Jesus is, one, that he was an exorcist, two, that he was a miracle worker, and three, that he was a teacher. We know those things with a lot of verifiability. It's exciting times to be living if you're going through and talking with people about that, because we have a lot of foundation on which to build those things. Jesus is a miracle worker. Our text today is in John chapter 5, and we want to look at a scene where Jesus encounters somebody who needs a miracle. So if you want to turn over there to John chapter 5, if you have a pew Bible in front of you and you want to grab that, it's on page 753. John's gospel gets into the life and the work of Jesus in a powerful way. He goes through and he talks about the nature of Jesus' work and what he's been doing. He's building a case, and that's one of the things you'll often hear. I remember when I talk to people about, what's the first thing that you want people to go through when they become a Christian? One of the first things you'll hear a lot of people say is the Gospel of John. Why? Because Jesus, as presented in the Gospel of John, is a figure that is divine. That John goes out of his way to show how Jesus was exactly the right person, sent from God exactly at the right time to minister to us and to provide for us. He gives us a view of Jesus that is, quite frankly, unbelievable and amazing, and then he provides us the grounds to believe. And Jesus in the Gospel of John, one of the many things that he is, he's a miracle worker. Now, we've already talked about how John is walking through how Jesus comes according to 7 signs, and those signs prove his divinity. This is the third sign that we're going to be getting into today. So if you want to, pick up with me as I begin reading in verse 1, and I'm going to go through a number of the verses. We're about halfway through verse 9, and then we'll go back and we'll talk a little bit about it. It says this: "After this, a Jewish festival took place, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And by the sheep gate in Jerusalem there is a pool called Bethesda in Aramaic, which has 5 colonnades. And within these lay a large number of disabled, blind, lame, and paralyzed." In verse 5, "One man was there who had been disabled for 38 years. And when Jesus saw him lying there and realized he had already been there for a long time, he said to him, 'Do you want to get well?' In verse 7, 'Sir,' the disabled man answered, 'I have no one to put me in the pool when the water is stirred up, but while I'm coming, someone goes down ahead of me.' 'Get up,' Jesus told him, 'pick up your mat and walk.' And instantly the man got well, picked up his mat, and started to walk." This is a familiar pattern in Jesus' ministry. He finds someone who needs a miracle. We can imagine that we see this often, particularly as Mark works out his story of Jesus' life. You read about it in other places in Luke and Matthew, how Jesus goes and gives sight to the blind. He heals the lame. He heals the paralyzed. He goes through and does these amazing works. And here, Jesus is going into Jerusalem, and you'll notice a couple things as we get into it. One, they immediately talk about, John immediately puts it in, there's a festival going on. Now, we're not sure what festival it was. It's probably not named because it's not important. One of the things that John's going to do in a couple chapters is he's going to begin orienting Jesus' revelation to us according to the Jewish festivals that are ongoing. When Jesus talks about, I am the light of the world, he does so amid the Feast of Tabernacles where Jerusalem would have been ablaze with light. Not only is he the light that you can see from miles, he's the light of the world. John has a way of positioning his gospel this way to show how Jesus is exactly that person that was sent from God. Jesus' divinity is shown through John's gospel in this way. But notice a couple things are going on here. One, that Jesus goes into Jerusalem, and he doesn't immediately go into the temple. And this is important because oftentimes Jesus' pattern when he gets into Jerusalem is immediately to go to the temple, but rather he stops. He goes in a gate that's on kind of the side of Jerusalem. It's not the main gates to the city. This gate still stands there today. If you and I were to go to Jerusalem, we would be able to go there and we'd be able to find the sheep gate. We'd be able to find where these pools are, the pool of Bethesda. And you'd be able to go and you'd be able to see the exact spot where Jesus is said to have done this. A pilgrim that was traveling in about the year 300 was remarked and recorded, about 1300, was recorded to have come into Jerusalem and found the same pool that was there almost about 1300 years later. So we know that Jesus' life and ministry has a location, it has a place. We know that Jesus is a miracle worker. And he goes into this place, and there's arrayed in a place where we have probably a couple of porches. And in the middle of that is a pool. And you'll see in the middle of that pool that's there, that's where you had a lot of people that were as John records, blind, lame, and paralyzed. And Jesus encounters this man who had been disabled for 38 years. Now, the word for disabled is the word that's used, the word there in verse 5 is the same word that's used in verse 3 when it begins describing the different number of people. Jesus encounters somebody who's disabled. What's interesting is Jesus seeks out this man. About 50-50 on Jesus' miracles. About 50% of them, people come up to Jesus and say, hey, Jesus, will you heal me? Or they try to do something with him. There's an instance where a woman grabs his cloak in an attempt to be healed. But there's also about half of the times where Jesus goes and seeks someone out. This is one of those times. He sees this man, a man who'd been laying there for 38 years. Now, we don't know a lot about this man. We know that this man had been there for a while. 38 years of his life, he had been disabled. Imagine being disabled for 38 years in the first century culture where you don't have family and friends tending to you. You don't have a support system. You're laying out there among crowds of people who are also disabled. You are an outcast. You are someone who people don't want to do with. One of the reasons is because a lot of people would think that your disease, your hurt, your disability was because of your sin or your parents' sin. We run into that in a couple chapters. The challenge that we see here is there's no explanation as to what happened with this man. This man could well be in his 40s. He could well be in his 50s. Imagine having been disabled for this long, having to figure out a way to supply for yourself, laying there on your mat as people come by day after day after day. You've run into a lot of prophets. You've run into a lot of people that get up and say, hey, I'm going to heal you. All you got to do is stand up and walk out, and you're still laying there day after day after day. You're laying amid a place where the myth was that if the water stirred up, it was an angel coming down possibly to touch it, to get it stirred. Most of our translations don't include that verse because it's probably one of those verses that we're saying is probably added a bit later. But there is a tradition that goes in with that. But yet you're still stuck there. And this man, all of a sudden, this guy, you've never seen him before, he kind of comes up to you, and he sees you laying there in your filth, on your mat, begging, and he looks at you compassionately. And he looks at you and asks you the one question that has been asked so often in your own heart, has been asked so often in your own life. Jesus asks him, do you want to be healed? Do you want to be healed? We don't get a lot of context for that. We don't get a lot of feedback about that. But here's a guy laying on a mat amid this time, and Jesus asks him, do you want to be healed? Jesus takes the initiation of going and finding this man and going out of his way. Of all the people that are laid out across these 5 porches or across these number of porches in the 5 colonnades, that Jesus comes and finds him and looks at him and asks him, do you want to be healed? Jesus looks at you and me today and asks that same question. You've got a hurt. You've got a hang up. You've got something that's holding you back. You've got a situation that you're struggling with. Jesus asks you today, do you want to be healed? Do you still believe in miracles? Do you still believe that Jesus is a miracle worker? Because miracles happen in a lot of different levels. Miracles just don't happen to the healing of somebody who's paralyzed or is blind or is lame. Healing happens within our hearts. One of the greatest miracles may well be that somebody that you know where you live, work, and play who's far from God can come close to God through the person of Jesus Christ. Maybe you need a miracle today. Maybe Jesus is asking you that exact same question. Do you need to be healed? Do you need to be healed? It's a question that Andrew's parents had. Can our son be healed? Can our son go through this? As they watched their son going through very quickly over the past several days in the story, they had seen him get to a place where he was struggling. And then suddenly they're gripped with the reality that they may well lose their son. A feeling of a foreboding that is building. But we often come to this and we ask, Jesus asked this man, do you want to be healed? He asks us, do you want to be healed? We look at what the man says. Look in verse 7. It says this, "Sir," the disabled man answered. Now, the word here, sir, he's being respectful. The word sir is probably the right one. Now, the word sir in the Greek is the same word that we use for Lord. But the man's probably just simply being respectful. He's saying, "Sir." The disabled man answered, "I have no one to put me in the pool when the water is stirred up. But while I'm coming, someone goes down ahead of me." So this disabled man sees Jesus, but what's intriguing is he hears a man asking him, "Do you want to be healed?" And he doesn't immediately say yes. Because if you're laying on the ground for 38 years with people passing by and somebody comes up to you and says, "Do you want to be healed?" After all of that, we would all sit there and say, "Well, yeah, I want to be healed." The challenge is that this man had a hardness around his heart, possibly. 38 years is a long time to be laid out, to not be cared for, to be on your own. So he responds to Jesus with an excuse. "Well, sir, I would like to be healed, but I can't make it down to the pool. Somebody always makes it ahead of me." The man doesn't realize that he's looking at Jesus. He doesn't realize that he's looking at Jesus, who is the Christ. He doesn't know who Jesus is because he's never seen Jesus before. He doesn't know who Jesus is because he's never met Jesus before. How many people in your life, how many people in my life don't know who Jesus is because they don't meet him on a regular basis, but yet they can be healed by him because Jesus asked all people, "Do you want to be healed?" He asked all people, "Do you want to be healed?" Jesus comes and provides himself. As John is showing here in the gospel, this is another sign attesting to his divinity. Jesus is the one who can come and give healing to all of us because we're all broken. We're all far from God. But through Jesus Christ, through his shed blood, he provides us the way to truly be healed. And it is a powerful thing. Yet Jesus encounters this man, and the man's response is an excuse. It is, "Well, I can't do it myself." Isn't it funny that oftentimes we put the onus of miracles on the people who need them the most? If you were only faithful enough, if you were only true enough, if you'll hear this, give enough money, you'll be healed. The challenge of it is that miracles are never something that we can do, but something that Jesus does for us. Miracles are never something that we can do, it's what Jesus can do for us. It's just like salvation. We can't do it ourselves. Jesus has to do it for us. So Jesus asks this man if he wants to be healed, and the man replies with a negative response. And then we see Jesus look at him, realizing that hurting people hurt people. Have you ever had one of those situations where somebody kind of lashes out at you, and you're kind of like, "Well, I don't understand. I was just trying to be helpful." Because the reality is hurting people hurt people. This guy's been sitting there for 38 years, laying in his filth, laying on his mat, seeing other people come and go. Maybe he's run into a snake oil salesman or two, somebody that was peddling a cure. If you only rub this ointment on this spot, it's going to miracle cure it. Because those guys existed back then too. Maybe he's run into a couple false prophets that said, if you only believe, then you'll be healed. And make sure you give a tithe to my ministry. Because there are false prophets in Jesus' day too. But this man encounters Jesus. He looks at Jesus. Jesus realizes and meets the guy where he is. And because that's the power of Jesus, Jesus meets us where we are. And he provides for this man. And notice what he does in the provision. Verses 8. Get up, Jesus told him. Pick up your mat and walk. And instantly the man got well, picked up his mat, and started to walk. And this is the first part of the passage. And we see that the thing that miracles do for us, the thing that miracles do, not only do they confirm who Jesus is, we've already seen that Jesus is a miracle worker, but we also see that miracles, past or present, remind us of Jesus' healing and salvation. Miracles, past or present, remind us of Jesus' healing and salvation. Because the testimony of miracles that happen in the New Testament, the testimony that goes through them, that we see that this is somebody who is not common among us. This is somebody who's not common with around the people that we encounter on a daily basis. But Jesus is somebody that's special. One of the ways that Jesus gets his first followers, the way that he gets the first crowds, and Gospel of Mark talks about this, he goes and he's preaching, but not only is he preaching, but he's casting out demons and he's healing people. Somebody in the first century that goes around casting out demons and healing people, they have a tendency to attract a crowd. Jesus is that person because he reminds people that with these miracles that he not only brings healing, but he also is bringing salvation. Imagine this man, 38 years, laying in the same space. Somebody that he's never seen before encounters him, because oftentimes we don't see Jesus until we actually see Jesus, and then he gets healed, he raises up, he walks, and he departs. It's such a tight, simple scene, and it has so much profound impact on who we are. Because miracles, past or present, remind us of Jesus' healing and Jesus' salvation. So what does the man do? Does he turn around and give Jesus a hug? Does he turn around and give him a high five or a low five? Because it's old days, it might be a low five. But no, he doesn't do that. Because then we hear kind of chords going down, because now that day was the Sabbath. In verse 10, and so the Jews said to the man who had been healed, this is the Sabbath, the law prohibits you from picking up your mat. And he, the man who'd been healed, replied, the man who made me well told me, pick up your mat and walk. But who is this man who told you to pick up your mat and walk, they asked. This is verse 12. And the man who was healed did not know who it was, because Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. Again, another pattern of Jesus' ministry. We're not comfortable with an inconspicuous Jesus. We're not very comfortable with an inconspicuous Jesus. I'm not very comfortable with an inconspicuous Jesus. I like the Jesus that walks around and heals people and takes credit for it. But that's not how Jesus operates, is it? I like the Jesus who walks around and gets his agenda or his will accomplished by fiat, but that's not how Jesus does it, is it? It's another example of Jesus working himself back in through the crowd, because Jesus has a greater testimony at heart. What's challenging for me here, though, is this guy had just been healed, and he immediately encounters religious leaders. There's always going to be somebody questioning your faith amid a time of miracle. There's always going to be somebody questioning your faith amid a time of miracle. I'm always reminded of that quote that you hear. It's an extra biblical quote from a guy named Noah. Everybody questions your faith until it starts to rain. But the reality is that miracles still happen. And you're going to have times in your life where you're going to have to step out on faith. This guy, 38 years. Now, the way that the gospel is oriented, you could take blame and you could say, yeah, this guy was in a bad mood still. But it had been 38 years. Imagine that, though. He knew exactly what to do when it was to walk. That tells me that the guy got hurt later in life. This is an older person, that somebody more esteemed in their age, that now can get up and walk. Imagine what that felt like. You're walking for the first time in 38 years and you encounter a religious leader who tells you to, what are you doing walking around with that mat? Because these guys knew who he was. They'd seen him. He was a known quantity in Jerusalem, or at least at the Sheep's Gate. That's a challenge, though, that there's so many people doubt the miracles that can happen because they've never seen the Jesus who can provide them. People doubt the miracles that can happen because they've never seen the Jesus who can provide them. How can you show people Jesus on an ongoing basis? How can you show people the miracle worker that's happened in your life, that happens in my life, that happens among our church family? When can you do that? How can you do that? What can you do with that? So Jesus then will pick up, look at verse 14 and 16, and it wraps this out. And after this, now the after this is the same thing you'll notice in verse 1. After this, John uses this metatau too. He uses this phrase to indicate some passage of time. It's not consistent. I think in verse 1 it probably meant a couple months later. I think in verse 14, it probably means later that afternoon. It's a passage of time. It's after a little bit of time. Jesus found him, that is the formerly disabled man, in the temple and said to him, "See, you are well. Do not sin anymore so that something worse doesn't happen to you." Notice that Jesus again goes and finds the man. He seeks the man out again. How often does Jesus seek us out? Again and again and again. How often does Jesus, after he's shown himself faithful to me, still seek me out in my unbelief? Because Jesus is a miracle worker. Jesus is somebody who comes and allows us to see that he is faithful. Jesus seeks this man out, this man who didn't give him a high five, didn't give him a hug, didn't really do anything. Not to be fair, the man probably reached down to get his mat, and by the time he turned around, Jesus may well have been gone. But the man, he encounters the man. Now the guy knows who he is, and Jesus reminds him, "I see that you are well. Do not sin anymore so that something worse doesn't happen to you." Now, that can sound a little bit tough, but Jesus isn't talking about the challenge of this man getting re-injured, but he's rather talking about the man's spiritual condition. He's talking about the man's spiritual condition. There is something worse than not being able to walk. There is something worse than having a sickness. There is something worse than having a child with something growing in their head. There is a place where you and I have to be mindful that there are people who need the greater miracle. And what's the greatest miracle in Jesus' life and ministry? What's the greatest miracle of all day? It's Jesus' resurrection. Jesus' resurrection gives us the greatest miracle of all time. Jesus' resurrection gives us the chance where we can move from being far from God to being near to God, to being opponents of God to being reconciled to God, to only having a temporary covering to having a complete covering. Jesus' greatest miracle will be his resurrection, and it all builds after the 7 signs of John are established. Jesus has a greater miracle coming, and it's a miracle that means something to me. It means something to you. The resurrection is Jesus' greatest miracle, and this is what he is reminding this man about. And it's a challenge because we see the biblical portrait of Jesus. We see that John does great things to remind us that Jesus has so much that goes on in his life and ministry, but that the biblical miracles confirm Jesus' divinity. The ongoing miracles affirm his salvation. Biblical miracles affirm Jesus' divinity. Jesus is exactly the person God sent exactly at the right time into this world to heal us, to provide for us, to save us. Ongoing miracles that we see today, even in our own lives and people that we know and communities that we encounter, places where we go, affirm his salvation. We confirm Jesus' divinity and we affirm his salvation because Jesus is the one who can do that. Andrew's parents, remember from our story, we pick up with that, they were at a place where they needed a miracle. They were at a place where their son needed to be healed. There was something growing inside of his head. They couldn't fix it. How helpless do they feel? How helpless would I feel? How helpless would you feel? But the principal person in this story isn't Andrew. The principal person in this story isn't his parents. The principal person in this story is a little girl that was 8 years old named Tess. And Tess, one night when her parents were having those hushed conversations, talking about how Andrew needs a miracle, got up one morning, emptied out her piggy bank, got $5.57 out of it, put it in her little pocket, and walked down to the local drugstore. She walked down to the corner pharmacy that was a couple blocks away, and she walked in, and she walked back to the pharmacist station. And she saw the pharmacist standing there wearing the white medical robe, talking to a man in very animated terms. They're locked in. There was a well-dressed man standing next to him. And little Tess walked right up to the counter, all 8 years old of her, and stood there and stared at the pharmacist. He didn't pay her much attention because pharmacists don't generally give much attention to 8-year-old girls, even those with a lot of temerity. But then she realized she needed to get his attention, so she pulled out a quarter and she tapped it on the counter, and that absolutely got his attention. He turned around and he looked at her and said, "What do you want?" And she goes, "I need a miracle." And he goes, "What are you talking about? We don't do that. It's a pharmacy. Besides, I'm talking to my brother. I haven't seen my brother in a long time." And then he turned back around to go talk to his brother, the well-dressed man that was standing next to him. And Tess wasn't dissuaded. She reached over the counter and began pulling on the back of his coat. And she goes, "You don't understand. My brother is the one who needs the miracle. My brother needs a miracle today. My mommy and daddy were talking about how my brother needs a miracle." And at that moment, the pharmacist and his brother both turned and looked at the girl as she continued. And she looked at them and said, "How much does a miracle cost at this pharmacy? Surely it's got to come some way," she's thinking. So the man that was standing next to the pharmacist looked at her, and he bent over a little bit and looked at her in the eyes, and she goes, "Well, what's your name?" And she goes, "My name's Tess." "And what's your brother's name?" "His name's Andrew." "What's wrong with Andrew?" She goes, "I don't know, but he's in pain and he hurts a lot. And he has something wrong in his head." Pretty good diagnosis from an 8-year-old. And the man goes, "And you brought money with you to buy a miracle?" She goes, "Yeah, I brought $5.57. And he goes, "Well, guess what? You're in luck, because a miracle costs $5.57 here." And then he went and he said, "Well, Tess, take me to your house and show me your brother." And he walked with her to her house, and he met her brother. And he took her brother back to his clinic, because you see, this was Dr. Carlton Armstrong, who was a noted neurosurgeon who lived in Chicago, who happened to be in town on that day visiting his brother that he hadn't seen in a couple of years. And he was the one person in the one place at the one time with the one set of skills that could actually heal and help Andrew. And he went and he took the young boy, he took him back to his clinic, and at no cost to his parents, he performed a surgery that removed the growing mass that was inside Andrew's head. And within a couple months, Andrew was running around, and he was fine. And Tess would often remark, Andrew needed a miracle, and it cost $5.57. Because the reality is that the miracle that happened may not exactly been what we had been thinking about. Maybe Andrew wakes up the next day and it's all gone. But rather, the larger miracle may have been exactly what it is. That a little girl who had the right spirit and enough faith walked in to try to find a miracle that only one person could provide. How often do you and I need to go to people who need to have a miracle, knowing that we have the one person that can provide? Miracles are important. Miracles give us hope. Biblical miracles tell us about Jesus. They affirm who he is. They confirm his divinity. Ongoing miracles affirm his salvation. So what do we do with miracles? What do we do with all this stuff? One of the things I'd encourage you to do is pray for those who need a miracle. Pray for those people who need a miracle. Somebody needs a miracle in your life, somebody needs a miracle in my life. Go before God and pray for them. I completely believe in prayer. I believe that as we get on our knees for other people, as we go on behalf, I don't understand how prayer works, but I know that it does. I can't tell you all the component parts of it, but I know that it works. Pray for those who need a miracle. Also, listen and rejoice when we hear about miracles. Listen and rejoice when you hear about miracles. Put them in your mind. Speak of them when you talk to other people. Then also consider that you may be the miracle that somebody needs. Consider that you may be this miracle that somebody needs. That you are that person, that little 8-year-old that goes into their life and provides for them. And then also, don't forget this, that always remember that miracles give testimony to Jesus' greater salvation. The greatest miracle that's ever happened in the entire world is that Jesus Christ was crucified. That wasn't a miracle, but rather that Jesus was resurrected on the third day. That is the miracle. The greatest miracle of all times, Jesus Christ is resurrected, is the truth that you and I get to participate in salvation. We get to be a part of a great church family. We get to be part of a beautiful salvation, that we get to take that salvation to other people. The greatest miracle of all times isn't just that Jesus came in and sought out a man around the pool of Bethesda and healed him, but rather that he heals you and I and provides healing for all that come, for whosoever believes in him, that we get to participate in that. Always remember that miracles give testimony to Jesus' greater salvation, because biblical miracles confirm Jesus' divinity and ongoing miracles affirm his salvation. How can you bring a miracle into somebody's life today?